Now we're going to kind of segue from our discussion of chemistry to molecules and atoms and things like that that are most relevant specifically to life. If this were a chemistry course, we'd look at the chemical makeup of other things like metals and things like that, but now we're going to focus specifically on things that are relevant to biological and relevant to life. Now, there are two types of biological molecules, in other words, two types of molecules that make up living things and the things inside of us, and those are organic and inorganic. Organic molecules are really loosely defined. They're molecules that contain a carbon and a hydrogen in them. There are some other scientific factors that determine what is organic, but for our purposes, for loose purposes, an organic molecule has a carbon and a hydrogen. An inorganic molecule has either only a carbon or only a hydrogen, or neither a carbon nor a hydrogen. Organic molecules also have carbon backbones bonded to hydrogen atoms. And one real functional difference is that organic molecules are capable of giving us energy, like sugar molecules, fat molecules, protein molecules are all organic. Things that are inorganic, like water, salt, carbon dioxide, may be necessary for us or for other forms of life, but they do not actually give us energy. Now, in terms of organic molecules, there are many different types of organic molecules. There are three basic types of nutrients that we eat that are organic. There are sugars, or starches, which are saccharides. Saccharin or saccharide comes from the same root of the word that means sugar. So starches are called saccharides. There are monosaccharides, which are simple sugars like glucose, fructose, sucrose, things like that. The basic structure of a monosaccharide is a single sugar molecule with 6 carbons. You'll notice there are 6 carbons along the outside of this hexagon. A C, C, C. That should be a C over there. It looks like an O, but it should be a C. Another C, another C, another C. Then you've got O's and H's kind of scattered around all over the place. There are some types of sugars with 5 carbons, but for the most part, sugars that we eat, like glucose and sucrose and fructose, have 6 carbons apiece. These are simple sugars. They can't be broken down because they don't need to be broken down. They are capable of being used by our individual cells for energy. In fact, more complex sugars, what we sometimes known as starches, get broken down into monosaccharides that our individual cells can use during the process of digestion. So polysaccharides, poly means multiple, so polysaccharides means multiple sugars, are large complex sugars, and they are really what we're starches, like breads, for example, are polysaccharides. So polysaccharides can be broken down and used, for example, glucose molecules are stored in the liver as the polysaccharide glycogen. For when you have lots of extra sugars that your body doesn't need, your body converts the sugars into glycogen, which is, I guess, kind of fat, and the body stores. And then later on, when it needs it, the body takes it and breaks it down into monosaccharides that the body can use for energy. So this is an example, by the way, of a polysaccharide. A polysaccharide is the same kind of thing. You notice they're all the same basic sugar molecules, the same hexagons. You don't see the C's all over the place, but they are there. They're the same hexagons with a carbon, 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 and lots of hydrogens and oxygens scattered all over the place that are not in the document, but they are linked to each other. And then when the body needs to separate them, it uses hydrolysis to kind of break them apart into individual monosaccharides that the body can use. And so your body stores the extra starches or extra sugars as glycogen or some other polysaccharide, and then when necessary, when your blood sugar level falls and your blood needs more sugar to produce energy, to respirate in order to produce energy for your cells, the body takes some of that, breaks it apart into individual glucose molecules, and then goes ahead and uses them. Here are some examples of different types, or we're going to continue with the examples of different types of organic molecules. The previous slide was the sugar group. Now we're going to move to the fat group. Really, the 3 major groups are sugars, fats, and proteins. Fats there are saturated fat and unsaturated fat. Saturated fat, all fat is made out of fatty acids, which are basically carbon and hydrogen. And these fatty acids can be saturated, that are packed as closely together and as tightly together as possible. And they also can be unsaturated, which are not fully saturated with hydrogen bonds. And we'll see what that looks like in a minute. Fats, by the way, are also known as lipids. If you see that term, lipids and fats are essentially the same thing, fat molecules. Saturated fats, which is a diagram on the left side, notice all of the bonds are full with the hydrogen. All of the carbons have a hydrogen attached to it. You got a long row of carbons over here, and you got hydrogens attached with a single bond to every single carbon that exists. That's saturated. There's no other extra room for the unsaturated ones, where not every carbon is filled with a hydrogen bond. You can see over here there's a double bond between these two carbons, but neither of these carbons has a hydrogen. Over here, every molecule can have 4 bonds. Every carbon molecule can have 4 bonds, one in each direction over here. And here, the bonds are all filled. The bonds are all saturated. Each carbon's got 4 different things attaching to it. Most of these carbons in the middle have 1 carbon on each side and 1 hydrogen on top and on the bottom. Over here, on the other hand, these 2 carbons have no hydrogens. There are no hydrogens over here in this area. So instead, they've got double bonds to each other. They've still got 4 bonds, but instead of having bonds to each of 4 different other atoms, they've got they're double bonded with each other. And that's why it's called unsaturated, because they don't have the maximum number of hydrogens that are possible. And also there's a bend in the bonding, causing an inability for the fats to get closely packed together. A trans fat, another type of fat, is a fat that's created artificially when food manufacturers turn liquid oils into solid fats by adding hydrogen or vegetable oils. One difference, by the way, is that saturated fats tend to be solid at room temperature. Saturated fats include things like butter and the congealed gravy that when you have gravy, or sometimes when you leave it out or put it in the refrigerator, it turns to solid. Chicken fat that turns to solid in the refrigerator, that's a saturated fat. Fats that are liquid at room temperature tend to be unsaturated fats, like oils, things like that. When food manufacturers, for various reasons, add hydrogen in order to turn what otherwise would be an unsaturated fat into a saturated fat, that's called a trans fat. The process of making trans fat is called hydrogenation. And of course, you can probably guess the reason for that. It's because you're adding hydrogen. You add hydrogen to what ordinarily would be an unsaturated fat to turn it into a saturated fat. Food containing trans fat must be labeled appropriately. The general principle is that saturated fat is not good for you, and unsaturated fat, well, too much could still make you fat, but generally speaking, unsaturated fat is relatively healthy. It raises your good cholesterol, your HDL, whereas saturated fat raises your bad cholesterol, which is LDL. And so if you have to eat fat, it's definitely a good idea to choose the unsaturated fat variety that occurs in vegetable oils, peanuts, peanut oil, things like that, rather than saturated fat, which comes from things like gravy and butter and things like that. Trans fats are also not good, because trans fats, I guess theoretically they would be if they had remained unsaturated fats, but because they're turned into saturated fats, that's not good. So if you look at labels on food, government regulations now require food manufacturers to be forthcoming. I mean, this is just one example. Honestly, I don't even know what food this is, but you can see this 1 cup of whatever it might be. I don't know, maybe it's some kind of a pasta product or a drink or something, whatever it is. You can see this particular food has 260 calories per cup, 120 of them are from fat, 13 grams of fat. Fat, by the way, tends to have about 9 calories per gram, whereas sugars and proteins tend to only have about 4 calories per gram. That's why they say fat tends to make you fat, because, fat has a lot of calories per gram. So it's got 13 grams, about 120 calories, that's about right. Saturated fat, 5 grams out of the 13. So if you infer from this From this, there are two types of fat: saturated and unsaturated. There's also trans fat, which was unsaturated until the manufacturer made it into saturated fat. So there are 5 grams of saturated fat and 0 grams of trans fat, which of course means that there are 8 grams of unsaturated fat, which makes it a relatively healthy food as fat goes. And finally, our last type of organic molecule are proteins. Proteins are not only do they give us energy, they also are a necessary component of many of the different things that we need in our body in order to function properly. The structure of a protein is a polymer of amino acids joined by peptide bonds. A polymer means a whole bunch of molecules next to each other. Amino acids are the building blocks of protein, just like sugar is the building blocks of starches. Lipids, or individual fat molecules, are the building block of fats. And so also amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and peptide bonds just means the type of bonds that you see in protein. Now, proteins are fairly complex molecules. Not only do they have the sugar, hydrogen, and oxygen that, the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that sugars do, they also have an element of nitrogen in them. Here's an example of a peptide bond. Don't worry about the termini over here, but you've got 2 protein molecules over here. You see each of them have carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen, and this one also does, and the bonds that bring them together are sometimes known as peptide bonds. Many examples of important proteins that we have in our body include enzymes. Enzymes are found in cells, and they help with chemical reactions. They help do things in the body. For example, when the cell needs to break down a type of molecule, or when the cell needs to create or just do pretty much anything with it. The enzymes are little protein molecules that are floating around, and they're actually allowing things to break apart and be put back together and do all the little things that cells need to do on a daily basis in order for us to survive. You've got keratin, which is also a protein that forms hair, nails, scales, feathers, horns, other things that occur on the exterior of many different type of living beings. There are hormones. Hormones are secretions, liquids very often, that are necessary for different parts of the body to do different things. Insulin, growth hormone, adrenaline, glucagon, which breaks apart glucose. Things also like estrogen and testosterone. Estrogen, which is in women, and testosterone, which is in men, or really males and females, not necessarily men and women, are also examples of hormones. There are also antibodies. Antibodies, which are substances in the bloodstream, really white blood cells, that fight off infection, and they are made out of proteins as well. Toxins, things that could be poisonous. Protein molecules can also be poisonous. We may not think of them as being necessary for life, but they may be necessary for animals to poison their pursuers, like snakes, which use toxins to defend themselves. Protein can also be a nutrient in food. It also gives us calories. It also gives us energy, as we discussed before, at the rate of approximately 4 calories per gram. Okay, and let's take a look at some end of chapter multiple choice over here. New government regulations require that foods containing trans fats be labeled appropriately, as we discussed. A trans fat is formed when manufacturers turn liquid oils into solids by adding hydrogen. This hydrogen process produces a solid fat. Why? Because, well, let's see. A. Allow fats to form tertiary and quaternary structures. Huh? Well, tertiary means triple, and quaternary means quadruple, or 4, but I don't know what that has to do with anything, so that is incorrect. Causes a phospholipid to form. A phospholipid would be something with a lipid and a phosphorus in it, but again, that doesn't really have anything to do with hydrogenated or solid or trans fats or anything like that. Allows fatty acid chains to pack together more tightly. Yeah, that's saturated. Saturated means when the bonds are totally packed together, so they are packed together more carefully. So certainly that looks like a good answer. Forms a wax molecule. Again, I have no idea what that has to do with anything. So the only answer, really, this is kind of an easy question. The only answer I see over here that makes any sense is C. Let's take a look at the next question. Sam tells Joe that organic, and by the way, when I'm doing these, what you can do if you like, I think I would recommend it actually, is to pause it and see if you know the answers, and then you can turn it back on and see about my explanation. Sam tells Joe that organic molecules are made out of carbon backbones with hydrogens. Okay. Joe doesn't understand how there can be so many different organic molecules if they're all made up of the same basic components. Sam explains that organic molecules, okay, so we're looking for something here different from organic than inorganic. A, vary because they possess different isotopes of carbon. Well, we didn't even discuss what isotopes are, but that means different types of carbon, but that has nothing to do with it. Well, organic and inorganic can contain the same kind of carbon. B, actually all have the same number but different structure, but different numbers of electrons. Not necessarily. That has to do with bonding, not different types of organic molecules, which are really based on the different numbers and types of bonds and things like that. C, are different because of the different types of hydrogen bonds that forms. Well, that actually could be true. It's not a terrible answer. It could be true in certain types of, for example, a difference between a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat, but that's only a very narrow distinction. In the obviously the types whether they have different types of hydrogen bonds is not going to be the difference between a protein and a sugar, only between a saturated and unsaturated fat. So C may be an answer for part of it, but D looks like the best answer because they vary based on different functional groups. They have different, some function because they've got combinations of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, whereas proteins have nitrogen also, etc. So D looks to me like it is the best answer in this case.